In my employment journey, I've held multiple types of jobs, from trapping braids of garlic on a street corner to planting fava beans on a bed of cow dung in 110-degree heat. With a growing family and limited job experience, I didn't have the luxury of being choosy. I did what I had to do to put food on the table. At one point, I applied for and got hired at one of those rent-to-own stores where you can pay weekly or monthly for home furniture and appliances. This type of business catered to those with bad credit, recent bankruptcy, or low-income families unable to borrow money. With no financing options available, they often fell victim to predatory rates and pay up to 3 to 4 times the value of the merchandise. I didn't know that going in. The store was in the same shopping center as the supermarket I worked at. It paid a little more, so I took a shot. I was what they called an account manager. It sounded very professional, but couldn't be further from the truth. Basically, I was a glorified furniture delivery guy, tasked with collecting overpriced rental fees from people already struggling financially. If they didn't pay, we'd repossess the merchandise no matter how much money they've already paid into it. We were the boots on the ground, the faces connected to this protection racket these poor people signed up for. It was a racket, and the longer I worked there, the clearer it became. The story I'm about to tell you happened while I was on my way out. I already submitted my resume to a couple places and was just waiting to hear back from them. I was tired of getting chased by dogs, threatened, and cussed out. It got to a point where I began to distinguish the people who were renting luxury items, like TVs and stereos, from the families who were renting home necessities, like refrigerators and bunk beds for their children. I would advise the latter. If your account is overdue and you see our trucks pull up, just don't answer the door. The particular store I worked at catered to a handful of exotic dancers. We knew this because on the contract they would sign, on the line specified for employment, they would write exotic dancer. We were only about 45 minutes away from the San Francisco red light district, which wasn't a long commute considering the amount of money they were potentially making. Whenever one of these pole technicians would come in, my colleagues would transform from disgruntled employees into customer support specialists. Even our manager, who would spend 90% of his time in the back office, would magically appear. It was comedy. So on this particular occasion, our delivery schedule was full. The trucks were packed with merchandise and we had a limited time frame to deliver all this furniture and set it all up. And then in comes, we'll call her Angel, who happens to be one of the pole whisperers who rented from the store. Like clockwork, our manager appeared out of nowhere. They engaged in conversation. He began showing her the big screen TVs we had on the showroom floor. It was in the early 2000s, and these rear projection TVs were ginormous and weighed a ton. My colleague, who I'll call Scott, and I were about to leave the store when our manager yelled for us to stop and told us to load the 60-inch big screen and add it to our already full delivery schedule for the day. He said it was for Angel, and he wanted to make sure she knew how much he appreciated her business. Yeah, I bet. I was livid. Adding to an already grueling delivery schedule, no matter who it was for, just meant more work for us. Scott, who is an expert at figuring out how to do the least amount of work without getting fired, suddenly got a burst of energy and motion for me to come help him load the TV. This guy. We put our delivery last and went about our day. Throughout the day, Scott was giddy with anticipation. What do you think she'll be wearing when we get there? I bet she has a pole in her living room. I hope she has roommates. I tuned him out and was just looking to get this over with. What if she wants to give us laptops? Angel said she'd be waiting for us outside at the agreed upon time. As we pulled up, there she stood, in baggy sweats and a t-shirt. She waved us into the parking lot. Since her delivery was sprang on us at the last minute, it was agreed to simply drop the TV off and that she would take care of the rest. Scott, a little disappointed she didn't greet us in a camisole, hopped out of the truck and unloaded the TV. Angel asked apologetically if we'd be able to give her a hand getting her TV up into her apartment. I reiterated we were only to drop it off and that maybe she can get a hold of her boyfriend or dad and they can come help her. She said her parents had disowned her and that she had a restraining order against her now ex-boyfriend who was just released from jail for beating her. She pleaded with us that she had no one and that if we would help her, she'd give us both $80 each. Before I had a chance to respond, Scott said, "Throw in some free passes and you got a deal." She agreed and said she lived on the 3rd floor. Scott looked at me with a sympathetic look, but I knew he was still hopeful she had some roommates or something. So we start lugging this 60-inch TV up 3 flights of stairs. We finally get it into her bare living room. At this point, I'm feeling bad for this young woman. With no parental support and recently escaping an abusive relationship, I softened my position and asked if she'd like us to hook up the TV for her. She said, yeah, that'd be great. Scott, ever the optimist, was still looking around her apartment for the imaginary pole and roommates he simulated in his head. After hooking up her TV and showing her some of the remote options, a 4-year-old boy came barreling out of the room. He looked at the TV and jumped up and down with excitement.
Oh, yeah.
"This is awesome, Mom." He quickly grabbed the remote and found the Cartoon Network. She smiled nervously and pulled out the $160 she promised us. I couldn't take it. She insisted, but I said, "Tell you what, you keep that money for you and your son, but there is something you can do for me." She asked, and what would that be? I said, "One of these Sundays, I want you to pick out a church, any church, and go to a Sunday service. I'm not going to follow up with you and see if you did it or not. This is strictly on the honor system. Would you be willing to consider that?" She looked at me and said, Don't you know what I do? I said, "Yeah, but that's not who you are." Her eyes began to well up with tears. She looked at her son and back at me. We both stood there and said nothing. Being in the industry, I'm sure she was conditioned to expect the worst from men. Night after night, wading through the college frat boys and middle-aged pot-bellied men, rushing home to wash off the cigarette smoke and glitter. I don't know what led her to become an exotic dancer, and frankly, it was none of my business. I thought maybe she could use some hope and some encouragement, a chance to see herself the way God sees her, to be seen and recognized as a daughter again. Out of nowhere, Scott's voice cut through the moment like a loud thunderclap. "What about those free passes?" She glared at him and went into her room. When she returned, she had a couple free passes in her hand to the club she danced at. I gave Scott a dirty look. He left her apartment and waited for me in the truck. I apologized to her and she said that's okay. It's one thing to be objectified by men because that's what you do to survive, but to experience that in your own living room is something else. He ripped her away from the hope of maybe exploring a new beginning and placed her back on that pole under those strobe lights. I left, and before she closed the door behind me, she said, Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
I started a new job soon after and never seen or heard from her again. Did she ever make good on our deal and go to a church service? Did she realize God wasn't mad at her and that she was still the apple of his eye? Did she know there was a new hope and a new future available to her and her son? Did she discover there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother? Sometimes we end up in situations where we have to do things we may not be proud of to survive. That should never stop you from understanding there's a hand bigger than yours willing to help, willing to lift you up out of the muck and mire of our foolish choices and destructive decisions. We are not our bad choices. Strangle that thought in its cradle. Don't give it life. You are not your mistake. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, worthy of love and protection, and an abundant life. Some neo-feminists say they feel a sense of empowerment dancing and are trying to normalize the industry of the clothing impaired by calling it a legit career choice. But as a father, I beg to differ. How can you be a feminist and a stripper? Wouldn't that make you a strippercrit? It's been over 18 years since that interaction. I recently seen Scott at a gas station trying to trade an Amazon gift card for some gas money. He didn't look too good. Seems his life choices took him down a rocky path. He didn't recognize me as he peered in my car window asking if I'd trade him money for the Amazon card. I declined. I wonder if he would have remembered me if I said, "No thanks, man, but I do have a couple free passes to Centerfolds in Frisco